I gave him everything, an entire house, the very place where I once held him as a baby. I signed the papers thinking I was giving him a future. Then a wedding invitation arrived, held at that same estate with a chilling line, "Private event. Family only. No seat, no name, no meaning." And when I stepped into the old garden, I saw my husband's ashes dug up to make room for a pool. If you think this is just another ordinary family story, you're dead wrong. Subscribe now so you won't miss stories this powerful and haunting. I didn't expect anything that morning. The kettle was whistling its soft tune the same way it did every day at 7:03. The same blue-rimmed mug sat by the sink. My slippers faded at the heel, but molded perfectly to my feet, glided across the kitchen floor I had scrubbed 1,000 times. My fingers curled around the edge of the counter as I waited for the water to cool, not out of need, but habit. That was life now. A collection of soft rituals carried out in silence. The mail came early that day. Thud. A small, careless sound against the front door like a whisper trying not to be heard. I walked slowly, joints stiff from age or maybe memory. The mail always held something: utility bills, community updates, charity envelopes, asking for what I no longer had. But that morning there was something different. A thick, cream-colored envelope pressed smooth and elegant, the kind that tries to make you feel special before you even open it. I turned it over. There it was. Julian and Celine, embossed in gold, flowing script, perfectly styled, effortlessly cold. I stared at the names a long time, letting them burn into my retinas. Julian, my Julian. The boy I raised from the time he was barely tall enough to reach the cabinet where I kept the sugar. Celine, beautiful, confident, calculated. The woman he had brought home 3 years ago with her sharp smile and polished charm. The one who always spoke to me like I was an old vase she didn't quite trust not to break. I opened the envelope carefully. My hands didn't tremble yet. Inside was a trifold invitation lined in pale silver. I took in the lines one at a time. Each word was a step deeper into a place I didn't recognize anymore. You are cordially invited to celebrate the engagement of Julian Hart and Celine Winters. Date April 22nd. Location Hartview Estate. I stopped reading there. Hartview Estate. That was what they were calling it now. Not the old Hart house, not home, not the place my husband Richard and I built over 30 years of sacrifice and patchwork dreams. No, now it was Hartview Estate, rebranded, restyled, rebricked into something Celine could show off on Instagram. But it wasn't that did it. It wasn't the gold lettering or the name change or the shiny new date. It was the last line written in quiet italics at the bottom corner. It was so small you might have missed it if you didn't know what you were looking for. Private family event, immediate family only. My fingers froze. My breath caught somewhere between my ribs and my throat. I sat down without realizing it, the chair catching me just as the wait arrived. I reread the line again and again as if repetition might change its meaning. Immediate family only. Immediate. I was the one who signed Julian's adoption papers. The one who wiped his fevered forehead at 2 in the morning when he had chickenpox. I sat through every parent-teacher conference, every orchestra recital he never wanted to be in. I sewed his graduation robe back together when it tore the night before the ceremony. But now it seemed I wasn't immediate enough. I placed the invitation on the kitchen table, centered it like a sacred document. The light from the window spilled across it, catching the gold embossing. My eyes drifted to the photo wall to my right. 12 neatly framed pictures hung in order of time, not value. Julian in his preschool sweater. Julian at 12 with the clumsy haircut I gave him in the garage. Julian and me on the porch swing laughing over something I can't remember but still feel. And below all those photos, tucked into a wooden bowl carved by my late husband, were thank you cards. Tiny cards from Julian written in crooked handwriting when he was young. Thank you for my new shoes, Grandma. Thank you for making my costume. Thank you for coming to my science fair. They weren't grand gestures, just slivers of gratitude frozen in ink. I kept them all. I don't know why. Maybe to remind myself that there was a time he remembered. My gaze settled on the last card I ever received from him. It was 3 years ago. "Thank you for the down payment, Grandma. We couldn't have done it without you." His handwriting had changed, grown smoother, colder, but I hadn't noticed then. I was too busy beaming, because yes, I gave them the house. I signed the deed myself, pen shaking slightly, as I transferred ownership of the very place Richard and I spent our final years together. I told myself it was love, a gesture of faith. I told myself Julian would understand what it meant, not just legally, but spiritually. But here I was, uninvited, not even given the courtesy of an explanation, just a gentle omission, a surgical erasure. I don't know how long I sat there. The tea had gone cold. The light shifted across the floor like time itself was trying to move me forward, but I couldn't follow. I picked up the invitation again, ran my fingers over the script. It was beautiful, I'll give them that. Elegant, polished, much like Celine. And much like Celine, it knew exactly what it was doing. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. It was a message. You are no longer part of this chapter. Thank you for your service. Now please disappear quietly. I closed the invitation, slowly folding it back along its creases, returning it to its envelope. I sealed it again, though there was no glue. It didn't matter. It would never be opened again. My voice surprised me. It came out low but steady. "I was the first to sign," I whispered. I looked around the kitchen. The homey chaos of spices on the shelf, the apron still hanging by the oven, the rug that always curled up at the corner no matter how many times I straightened it. It was mine, all of it, bought with my salary as a public school teacher stretched out over 40 years. Richard and I had built this life brick by brick. I signed every document that gave you a life I said to no one. The house, the college fund, the medical insurance when you were still on my plan at 25, all of it. My name was always first, always in blue ink, always at the bottom of the page that meant you were protected. But now my name didn't even make the guest list. I stood slowly. My knees ached as they always did in the morning, but I welcomed the pain. At least it was honest. I walked to the drawer beside the sink, pulled it open. Inside, nestled among old coupons and paper clips, was a photograph. The last family photo we took before Richard passed. Julian sat beside me, his arm casually draped around my shoulders. Celine smiled into the camera like she had always belonged. I held the photo for a moment, then slid it into the envelope alongside the invitation. Let it all stay together. Let the memory sit where it belongs, pressed between pages of something that no longer opened. I placed the envelope back on the table, and then I sat, back straight, eyes clear. The silence around me was vast, but it wasn't empty. It was waiting. Something in me shifted that day. Not dramatically, not like an explosion, more like a lock clicking open. They may have removed my name from the guest list, but I was not gone. I was not finished, and I was done waiting for permission to exist. I didn't sleep that night. The invitation stayed on the table untouched, while the house breathed around it walls that had heard every version of my life. My tea went cold twice. I reheated it just to feel like something could still be warmed. Sometime after 2 a.m., I opened the bottom drawer of my bedroom dresser, the one I rarely touched. Inside, folded carefully between the pages of my husband's old ledger book, were the documents that transfer of title. My name on the deed crossed out in a firm stroke. Julian's name, neat and confident, typed beneath. The signature line stared at me. I remembered the day I signed it. 2 weeks after Richard's funeral. I had worn the same black coat I wore to the service, because it still smelled faintly of him. Julian stood across the table, his hands in his coat pockets. Celine beside him holding the pen like it belonged to her. "Are you sure, Grandma?" he asked that day almost sheepishly. "I'm sure," I'd said. My voice had been calm, still wrapped in grief, still believing I was passing on something sacred, not just a house, not just land, but memory, shelter, identity. "It's yours now," I said. "Take care of it." And Julian had nodded, his eyes soft with something I mistook for love. Celine had leaned forward then and whispered, "We'll take good care of everything, Olivia. You'll always be part of this." I believed her. That's what shamed me most now. Not the signature, but the belief. The next morning I turned on my computer. My fingers moved slowly across the keyboard, clumsy with emotion. I typed Julian and Celine's names into the search bar. The first thing that came up was the event site, a gleaming website, custom designed, their names etched in looping cursive, Julian and Celine, a celebration of legacy and love. Legacy. That word caught in my throat like a thorn. Whose legacy? I clicked through the tabs. Venue Hartview Estate. Capacity 200 guests. Style formal garden ceremony with cocktail reception. Note: private family access to garden path and memorial terrace. Memorial terrace. I stared at the screen, my chest tightened. There had never been a memorial terrace. There had only been Richard's ashes buried beneath the rose bushes by the old stone bench. He had asked for that spot because it was where he read his newspaper every Sunday, where we had coffee every spring morning, where Julian once built a pillow fort and declared it his castle forever. I knew that garden like I knew the lines in my palm, and now it was a bullet point on an event plan. I shut the laptop quietly, stood, moved on instinct. By late afternoon I was on the bus. I didn't call ahead. I didn't want anyone preparing for me. I wanted to see it as it was not the version they'd curate for Grandma, but the version they showed to investors, planners, influencers. When I stepped off at the familiar gravel path that curved up to the estate, the air felt different. Lighter somehow, but not in a comforting way. In the way that places feel once they've decided they don't belong to you anymore. The estate loomed ahead, refinished, repainted, remade. The iron gate had been replaced with a modern archway, etched with the words, Hartview. There was no longer a mailbox, no welcome mat, just polished stone and an imported bonsai tree in place of the oak sapling Richard and I planted when we first moved in. I walked up the path, slowly, deliberately. The front door was open. People moved in and out, caterers in black shirts, florists with bouquets the size of toddlers, an event coordinator barking orders into a headset. No one looked at me twice. A young man in a crisp white shirt came toward me carrying a clipboard. "Delivery entrance is around back," he said, not unkindly. I blinked. "I'm not making a delivery." He looked confused for half a second, then distracted by his earpiece. "Sorry, ma'am. Prep staff's not allowed in through here." Prep staff. I wanted to laugh. Maybe I did softly. I didn't correct him. I simply turned and walked around to the side path past the kitchen window where Julian used to sit and beg for more cookies. The garden was busier than I expected. Men in jeans and tool belts were hammering wooden frames into the earth. Rolls of turf lay peeled open like skin. Flower boxes had been emptied and replaced with square tiles that gleamed under the spring sun. But my feet carried me to the back corner, to the roses, or what used to be roses. They were gone. In their place, a shallow rectangular hole was being lined with cement. A man in a hard hat stood at its edge, barking instructions to two others carrying a steel pipe. The bench was gone. The soil was dug up. The mulch was gone. And so was Richard. I froze. Everything inside me screamed, but no sound came out. "Excuse me," I said, voice hollow. "What is this?" One of the workers looked up, shrugged. "Infinity pool. Right here." "Yep. Party wants it facing the trees' sunset direction. Gotta dig deep for the base support." My knees buckled. I caught myself on the fence post, heart pounding. Was there anything buried here underneath? The worker scratched his head. "Just some old stone marker. Looked like a bird bath or something. We tossed it." "Sorry, ma'am." It wasn't a bird bath, it was a headstone. Hand-carved by Richard's own brother, placed by me. I turned, stumbling back toward the path. The air was thick now, like breathing through cloth. My eyes scanned the garden again, this strange imitation of a place that once held my life. Julian wasn't here, neither was Celine, but their presence was everywhere. In every corner repainted, every root dug up, every memory sterilized and turned into a photo op. I kept walking. My hands trembled, my mouth was dry. When I reached the edge of the lawn, I turned back once more. The garden stretched behind me, perfectly groomed. A shell of what it had been. But I could still see it. Richard kneeling by the rose bush, Julian, age 9, chasing fireflies, me laughing barefoot, carrying lemonade. All gone, paved over, for a pool. Back on the bus, I sat alone in the third row. The seat was cold. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered, but my eyes had changed. They weren't tired, they were awake. Something inside me had cracked, but it wasn't breaking. It was opening. That night I took out the deed papers again, the title transfer, my signature sitting there like a confession. I traced my finger over it, then I flipped the page. There, tucked behind the copy, was a yellowing envelope I had almost forgotten, sealed in Richard's handwriting. My heart paused. I opened it. Inside was a letter, short, clipped, typical Richard. If Julian ever forgets who this land belongs to, remind him who gave it to him. That was all. No sentiment, no rambling, just one line, a line that told me what I already knew. This wasn't about a party. It wasn't about an invitation. It was about legacy, about memory, about a promise paved over for convenience. Julian had forgotten. Celine had never cared. But me, I remembered everything, and I was done being the only one who did. The next morning smelled like rust and old paper. I didn't brew tea, didn't water the geraniums. The world inside me had shifted, and all my small, careful rituals no longer seemed worth repeating. I stood by the window long after the sun rose, staring at nothing, until the weight of what had been done and what I had allowed dragged me toward action. At 9:16 a.m., I picked up the phone and dialed the number I hadn't used in nearly a year. Dalton Reeves, attorney. He was the one who had handled the house transfer to Julian. A practical man, good with details, not so good with faces. But he'd always spoken to me with respect, and at my age that was currency. The receptionist answered. Her voice was syrupy, too cheerful for the gravity in my tone. May I tell him what this is about? Yes, I replied. Tell him it's about what happens when the person who signed everything realizes what they've signed away. There was a pause. She didn't know how to respond to that. Please hold. 2 minutes later, Dalton came on the line, breathless, like he'd jogged to the phone. Olivia. Is everything all right? No, I said plainly, but I'm hoping you can help make it so. His office hadn't changed. Same faux mahogany desk, same framed law degree from UCLA, same faint scent of leather-bound files and controlled ambition. But something in me had changed. I wasn't the woman who'd walked in here last time smiling through grief, handing away a lifetime with trembling gratitude. This time I didn't sit until I was ready. Dalton watched me carefully, sensing it. I need to understand what rights, if any, I still have, I began. I transferred the house, the land, all of it. But I need to know if there's anything left that bears my name on paper or in principle. He opened the file. The one with my name on the tab already dog-eared and faded. Well, from the documents I have, he said, scanning with professional detachment, the property was fully transferred to Julian Hart with no contingencies noted. It was a clean transfer, signed, notarized, and filed with the county clerk. I swallowed, meaning you no longer hold legal ownership. Unless he hesitated, there is a prior or superseding document. Something with conditions that would invalidate or override this transfer. Like a will, I asked. He nodded. Exactly. If Richard left behind a will that included stipulations, and that document was dated after or tied to the original deed, there could be grounds for challenge. But Olivia, his voice softened. Do you know of such a document? I don't, I said. But Richard was a man of layers. He always kept one drawer locked, one story untold. Dalton leaned back, folding his hands. Then that's your starting point. If there's a document out there, find it. Back at home, I went straight for the box. It had been sealed since the day after the funeral. A small cedar chest tucked beneath the floorboards in my closet, held closed with a tiny brass latch. It smelled of cedar, and something older, grief maybe, or memory. I placed it on the kitchen table and stared at it like it might bite. Then I opened it. Inside were the things I couldn't bear to part with. His wedding band, the old pocket watch he refused to get repaired because it was still right twice a day, a faded Polaroid of us on our first anniversary, standing in front of a half-built house and grinning like fools, and then a folder, unlabeled, tied shut with a string of blue thread. I pulled it free. Inside was a typed document on thick yellowed paper, dated 1998. The top read, Last Will and Testament, Richard E. Hart. I'd seen this before. We both had copies, but this one was different. At the end, after the witness signatures, was a handwritten addendum in Richard's unmistakable block print. I read it once, then again. Then I whispered the words aloud like a prayer. If my heir fails to maintain the values of the Hart family estate honor preservation and remembrance, then all transferred property may be subject to revocation per Olivia Hart's discretion and returned to the community for memorial purposes. There it was, a clause, a hinge. It wasn't notarized, no legal countersignatures. But it was dated and witnessed by our old friend Marcus, retired judge, now long gone. Was it enough? I didn't know. But it was something more than the silence they'd left me with. I sat back the paper, trembling in my fingers. They had desecrated Richard's resting place, turned a home into a showroom, lied, omitted, and exiled me from the legacy I helped build. And maybe, just maybe, that clause was the key. But I couldn't do this alone. Imani was the first person I thought of. We hadn't spoken in nearly a year, not since her husband passed and she'd moved across the county to be closer to her daughter. But I kept her number. I always do that with people who matter. She answered on the second ring. Liv, her voice was startled, curious. I need your eyes, Imani, I said quietly. Your legal eyes. There was a pause, then the sound of a chair scraping back. Talk to me. 20 minutes later, she was in my kitchen. Some friendships don't ask for backstory, they just show up. She sat across from me, her dark curls tied back tight, glasses perched on the edge of her nose. I slid the folder toward her. She read it in silence, all of it. When she reached the handwritten clause, she paused, then looked up. He wrote this, she asked. Yes. And the witness, Marcus, from the courthouse. She nodded slowly, lips pursed. It's not airtight, she said. But it's not nothing. In the right court with the right framing, it could be enough to freeze things, to raise questions, especially if what you told me about the land is true. It is, I said. They're building on top of Richard. Imani's jaw tensed. She folded her hands. I don't think this is just about legacy, Liv. I think there's a money trail. If they're repurposing the property, they're not doing it out of nostalgia. There's a paper trail somewhere, permits, investment contracts, maybe even fraud if your name was still attached during any of it. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had never thought to check. Never imagined Julian would use my name, my past, my identity without my consent. They might be using you to lend credibility, Imani said. You're the Hart. He's the Hart by name, but you're the legacy. Investors like that kind of thing. Family property. Heritage estate. It makes the money feel clean. I sat back stunned. The air was suddenly heavier. So what do I do? She leaned forward. You start digging. Quietly. And you don't stop until you know what you're actually up against. You want this to mean something. She tapped the clause. Then make it mean something. She reached into her bag and pulled out a card. I know someone. Used to work with the county financial division. Now he freelances. Discreet, ruthless. He can help you trace any misuse of your name, any contracts you weren't told about. I took the card, read the name. Hayes Montgomery, private investigator. Do you trust him? I asked. She looked me dead in the eye. I trust him more than I trust your grandson. We sat in silence. Outside, the wind moved through the branches like it was trying to tell us something. I looked down at the folder again, at Richard's handwriting. His last words, not to Julian, not to the world, but to me. Remind him. And I would. This wasn't revenge. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something. A return. A reckoning. I looked up at Imani. Call him, I said. Her smile was tight. You got it, Liv. I didn't knock. I didn't announce myself. I didn't wear black like grief. I wore gray, neutral, invisible, like the walls people stop seeing after they've repainted the room too many times. The invitation I never received gave me the freedom to arrive uninvited. It was dusk when I stepped through the iron gate at the back of the estate, the one Richard installed himself when Julian was 7 after he tried to sneak out one night to catch fireflies. He called it the Gate to the Stars. Now it was polished steel with a key code. But someone had left it ajar. I walked through without touching it. The lawn had been transformed, elegant string lights crisscrossed above like stars on wires. Rows of candlelit tables lined the freshly manicured grass. Laughter fluttered through the garden like moths, beautiful and just slightly out of reach. The smell of roasted duck and something citrusy floated through the air, laced with perfume too expensive for memory. I stayed at the perimeter just beyond the hedge beneath the shadow of a newly installed sycamore that hadn't yet rooted. It swayed in the breeze like it didn't belong. Neither did I, but I was there. From my angle, I could see everything. Julian stood near the center fountain. Yes, they'd added a fountain wearing a navy suit that looked tailored crisp. He always hated suits, complained about how stiff they made him feel. Tonight he looked like he'd been born into one. Celine stood beside him in a backless champagne dress, holding a flute of something sparkly. She glowed, or maybe she gleamed, like cut crystal. They looked perfect and completely unreal. A voice crackled over the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could just have your attention for a moment. Julian." The crowd quieted into that polite hush that happens when money is about to speak. He adjusted the mic, coughed, softly glanced at Celine, who gave him a subtle nod. His voice was confident, warm, rehearsed. "I just want to take a moment to thank you all for being here tonight. Celine and I are overwhelmed by your support, your generosity, your belief in what we're building both personally and professionally." I felt that word strike me, professionally. 3 years ago, Julian continued, this place was just an old house with creaky floors and outdated wallpaper. But it was home. It belonged to someone who gave everything to make sure I never lacked for anything. My hands curled around the bark of the tree beside me. My breath caught. "My grandmother, Olivia Hart," he said. "She's not here tonight." He paused just long enough to create the illusion of regret. But without her, none of this would have been possible. She sacrificed so much so that I could stand here today in this beautiful space with the woman I love. People clapped politely as if applauding a ghost. Julian smiled, but his eyes never scanned the crowd. He didn't look for me, didn't search the corners. I wasn't in his mind, not truly. I was a narrative, a stepping stone, a softened anecdote in the myth of his self-made manhood. The applause faded. Celine stepped up, took the mic with a smile that could slice. "We believe in the future," she said, "in reimagining legacy. And we're thrilled to announce that Hartview Estate will soon open its doors not just to our friends but to the world." There was a small ripple in the crowd, a low buzz of anticipation. "Thanks to the early support of our investors," she continued, "we've secured the first round of funding for Hartview Retreats, a luxury eco-resort experience rooted in family, memory, and place." The words were honeyed, smooth, lethal. She raised her glass. "To legacy and to the future." The crowd raised their glasses. I didn't move. A server passed by me, not even noticing. I could have been a statue. I could have been the wind, but I heard it. Celine stepped down from the makeshift platform and leaned toward a tight circle of her friends. Her laugh was airy, practiced. Her voice quieter now, but I knew how to listen. I'd spent decades listening to students, to whispers behind doors, to my own silence. "It's crazy," she giggled. "The whole place was practically falling apart. But now we've got full rights to everything. Even the land behind the terrace, Julian says the surveyors approved it yesterday." One of the women touched her arm. "Are you actually going through with the spa build?" Celine nodded, her mouth curving up with delight. "Oh, totally. The investor from Arizona already signed the letter of intent. Once we finalize the paperwork, it's ours to design. Can you believe it, right on the burial lot? But don't worry, we're keeping it tasteful." Burial lot. That word didn't sink, it stabbed. My knees threatened to fold beneath me, but I stayed rooted. The bark under my fingers grounded me. I wasn't angry yet. I was beyond that. I was still. They hadn't just paved over a memory. They were selling the tomb of my husband as a marketing feature, turning the grave of the only man who ever loved me truly into a line item in a wellness brochure. And Julian, he hadn't just let it happen. He'd handed them the shovel. I stepped back from the tree, the light from the candles glinting off the wetness in my eyes. I wiped my face once slowly, but I didn't retreat. I kept watching. A waiter passed by offering oysters. Celine took one and leaned in toward her friend, whispering behind her napkin. Honestly, I'm surprised the old woman didn't show. She's too proud for her own good, but maybe she finally learned when to stay in her lane. They all laughed, gentle, civilized laughter, the kind that slices deeper than screaming ever could. I exhaled through my nose. The night was warm, but my breath fogged. She didn't know I was there, and that was her mistake. They all thought I was finished, folded, tucked away, but I was watching, and I was remembering, because I had built this, brick by brick, memory by memory. I was the woman who painted the shutters each spring, who planted the roses, who scrubbed the mud off Julian's soccer cleats and read every school newsletter and stayed up nights filing grant paperwork so we could keep the house through Richard's hospital bills. And now I was the one without a name, without a seat, without a right to grieve on my own land. But I was also the one who still held a weapon they had underestimated: memory and a paper trail. I stepped backward into the dark, 1 foot at a time. Their laughter floated behind me like perfume, sweet, artificial, fleeting. As I reached the back gate, I turned for one last look. Julian raised his glass again, smiling to the crowd, basking in applause he didn't deserve. And for a brief moment, I saw his face clearly, not the boy I raised, not the child who used to fall asleep on my shoulder, but a man who had sold something sacred and called it vision. I slipped through the gate and let it shut behind me. The click echoed like a verdict. And in that quiet, moon-drenched moment, I whispered to the wind, "You carved my name out of the stone. Now watch how I etch it into fire." The next morning, the air was thick with unfinished things. I'd hardly slept after the engagement party. I'd replayed Julian's voice in my mind on a loop, how polished it had sounded, how removed. "My grandmother, Olivia Hart. She's not here tonight." No regret, no searching glance, just a scripted footnote in a performance he knew would be recorded, shared, liked, and praised. I sat at the kitchen table with the lights off and the folder from Richard's will still open in front of me. I had memorized the clause by now, every word. All transferred property may be subject to revocation per Olivia Hart's discretion. The word discretion pulsed like a heartbeat. What they had not expected was that I still had it, that quiet power they assumed had expired with my age. I dialed Imani just after 7 Huzru a.m. She answered with her usual calm, even though her voice was husky from sleep. "He's selling the bones of our family," I said. "Then it's time to bring in someone who knows where to dig," she replied. By noon, we were sitting in her apartment across town waiting for the man she recommended, Hayes Montgomery. He arrived without ceremony. No suit, no leather briefcase, just a gray windbreaker jeans and a satchel slung over one shoulder. His hair was more salt than pepper, his eyes the color of wet asphalt, dull but watchful. "Mrs. Hart," he greeted me with a slight nod. "Ms. Imani tells me you've got a gut feeling that doesn't sit right." "I've got more than a gut feeling," I said, handing him the envelope. "I've got a legacy being stripped down to studs." Hayes sat without a word and opened the file. He didn't comment, just read. He flipped through Richard's clause, the estate transfer, Julian's name, Celine's too. After 10 minutes, he spoke. "I need 3 days," he said simply, "but I'll give you the first whisper tonight." By that evening, he called back. "2 things," Hayes said. "First, your grandson's name is attached to something big. Second, your name isn't." I swallowed hard. "What's the something?" "Hart Living Holdings," he said. "Formed 6 months ago. Registered under Julian Hart, CEO. Celine Winters, CFO. It's an LLC, but the real meat is in the brand expansion, Hartview Retreats, Heartline events, and something called Hart Vantage Residences." "Residences," I repeated, my voice tightening. "Luxury villas," Hayes confirmed. "Long-term development plan. 35 units, spa, yoga center, sacred heritage trail," whatever that means. "It means my husband's ashes are now a bullet point on a brochure." He was silent for a beat. "Then it gets worse." "Of course it did. They've already started the financing process." Hayes continued. 3 different lenders, 2 declined. The third, One Spruce Capital, is deep in due diligence. If the numbers check out, the loan will fund in weeks. I felt something cold slide down my spine. "And the land?" I asked. "Used as collateral," he said. "The entire parcel, including the garden, the west hill, and the lakeside corner." "They don't own the lake corner," I said sharply. "They say they do," Hayes replied. "According to their surveyor, it was included in the transfer documentation." His voice grew quieter. "They used a consolidated title form probably created by Celine. It's slick, and from the outside it looks airtight." I closed my eyes. "And my name?" "You're nowhere on it," he said. "No mention. Not as previous owner, not as founder, not even in footnotes." I had become a ghost inside my own legacy. "And here's the kicker," Hayes added. "They're using your maiden name, Olivia Burns, in their investor narrative. painting the project as a continuation of Burns Hart heritage led by third-generation descendants committed to community values. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "They've rebranded me," I whispered. "Not as a person, but as a concept." Hayes sighed. "They've weaponized sentiment. That's what sells." I wanted to scream, but all I could manage was silence, a silence so sharp it cut me from the inside out. "Mr. Montgomery," I said, "have I signed anything that allows them to do this?" "I'm still digging," he replied. "But if you ever signed anything with vague language, any durable power of attorney financial delegation or estate simplification forms, then yes, they might have lured you into giving them everything." I didn't remember signing anything like that. "But grief has a way of turning memory into fog," Hayes said. "Think back. Did they ever ask you to sign something for tax purposes, to streamline bills? Anything that seemed routine?" My mind flashed. "Celine," her voice soft, insistent. "Olivia, we just need you to sign this little addendum to the transfer papers. It'll save us all a headache when we file. You don't want to deal with taxes in your retirement, do you?" She had brought the notary, smiling, polite, professional. Julian had stood behind her, saying nothing. I had signed it. My stomach twisted. "I think I did," I said quietly. "I think I gave them more than the house." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "If that's the case, we'll find it. But I'm going to need full access, your accounts, your email, anything you've received from them in the past year." "You'll have it." "And Olivia?" "Yes. This isn't just betrayal," he said. "It's systemic. It's organized. And it's profitable. Don't be surprised if this goes deeper than family." I hung up and sat in the dark. The numbers didn't lie, and the people behind them didn't care who they buried to get what they wanted. I reached for the photo on the side table, the one of Julian and me ages ago, both laughing under the old oak tree. It was faded now, the color bleeding out of the edges. I turned it face down. The next day Hayes returned. He laid out a printout of transaction records, dozens of them. Small transfers, payments to design firms, landscaping consults, site surveys, legal filings under a shell firm called Oliveira Advisory, a name close enough to mine to raise eyebrows, but far enough that I might never have noticed. Celine had signed most of the documents. Julian's name appeared occasionally, but always as a rubber stamp. "She's the architect," Hayes said. "He's just the signature." I studied the papers. "Does it matter that I didn't know what I was signing?" "It matters ethically," he said. "But in the eyes of certain contracts, intent doesn't matter, only the ink does. If we want to win this, we need to prove coercion, deception, or mental duress." "I wasn't mentally unfit," I said. "I was just trusting." Hayes looked me straight in the eyes. "Then let's prove they betrayed that trust." He slid another document toward me. "This," he said, "is their investor pitch deck, a copy I pulled from One Spruce Capital." I scanned the first page. "Hart Living Holdings, Reclaiming Family, Rebuilding Legacy." My photo was there. My face. Me standing in front of the house holding a tray of lemonade. A photo Celine took years ago on a summer afternoon when I thought she loved me. They had cropped Julian out, left me smiling, frozen in time, framed like a mascot. "They used this?" I asked, the words thick in my throat. Hayes nodded. "Everywhere. Website, deck, even the promotional video. You're the matriarch, the story, the brand." But I wasn't the owner, wasn't even invited to the party. I sat back breathless. They'd used my name, my image, my history to sell a future I wasn't welcome in. But now I had proof, and I wasn't the one on trial anymore. I was the witness, and soon I would be the storm. It was early when I returned. The morning hadn't warmed yet. The sky was still steel gray, the kind of color that made you feel like the world was holding its breath. I parked far from the estate, not because I was hiding this time, but because I wanted the silence of the walk. I needed the rhythm of gravel under my shoes, of breath rising with resolve. The wind had picked up overnight, strong enough to sway the treetops, but not so strong that it would stop construction. They didn't pause for weather, not when money was on schedule. As I neared the western edge of the property, the part we used to call the quiet side, the smell of concrete and fresh lumber hit me first, sharp, sterile, wrong. They had already cleared it. The rose bushes were gone, of course. I knew that. But now the old hedgerows had been leveled too, and the low stone wall that Richard and I built together, him with his bare hands, me handing him bricks while he cursed about the slope, was shattered. Not even dismantled, just crushed, demolished like an inconvenience. Beyond the rubble was open dirt, a gaping wound of earth where once we buried not just his ashes but our history. I walked across it slowly. No one stopped me. The crew wasn't here yet. Or maybe they didn't come today. Maybe someone had warned them. Or maybe, just maybe, the universe had cleared the space so I could see it unguarded, raw, and unashamed. The bench was gone. Not just removed, gone. Not even the impression of its legs in the dirt remained, as if it had never been there. As if Richard had never read his Sunday paper sipping his lukewarm coffee while I trimmed the roses and hummed old jazz standards out of tune. Gone. I stopped in the middle of the clearing and looked around. The wind tugged at my coat. Leaves twisted above. For a moment I thought I heard Richard's voice in it, just a syllable, a hum. But it was only memory, the ghost of a voice shaped by wind and guilt. I sat down on the dirt. Not on a bench, not on a cushion, on the raw ground. My knees ached, my spine protested. I welcomed the discomfort. I pulled from my bag a small leather-bound notebook, the one Richard kept in his drawer. His quiet thoughts, he called it. He wasn't one for big speeches, but he wrote them instead in that careful all-caps handwriting of his. Each page held no more than a paragraph, little pieces of himself sealed in silence. I flipped to the back, to the page I couldn't stop thinking about. The final one, only one sentence. When someone uses your name to build something without protecting your honor, then losing the house is justice, not tragedy. That was Richard, blunt, unapologetic, and right. They'd used my name, my face, our family, not just in contracts, but in narrative. They sold my silence as consent, my generosity as surrender, and now they were laying down pool tiles over the bones of everything sacred. I stared at the page, the wind fluttering the corners like the notebook itself was breathing. He had known. Even back then, even before the paperwork was signed, Richard had known there was a chance it could all unravel. That legacy wasn't something handed over with keys and signatures, that it could be twisted, shaped into a weapon if not guarded properly. I ran my thumb over the ink, over his words, and then I stood. There was no one to hear me, no audience, but I spoke anyway. "Do you hear that, Richard?" I said aloud. "They've paved over your grave. They've turned our promises into sale pitches, our walls into renderings. They've carved us out of our own story." The wind didn't answer, but I didn't need it to, because the answer was already inside me. "They think silence means surrender," I continued. "They think I gave them everything because I was old or tired or lonely." I paused, but I didn't give them this. I looked down at the dirt, the sacred dirt, the one patch of earth I could still remember through "feel alone." The texture of it, the warmth of it on the day we laid his ashes down, the solemn quiet when we pressed our palms together and promised never to let anyone forget. "They took it," I said, and then I said what I hadn't dared to before. "But I'm taking it back." I crouched and picked up a handful of the soil, held it in my palm, let it fall between my fingers slow and heavy. Not a word from Julian, not a whisper of apology, no letter, no call. Celine had smiled while signing papers worth millions, and had never once asked where the roots of those papers were buried. And me, I had allowed it. Out of love, out of blind, open-palmed love. But Richard didn't leave his legacy in Julian's hands. He left it in mine, and I had one job left. I dusted off my hands and stood straight. Straight like the woman I used to be before they convinced me quiet was grace. That silence was what made me dignified. It never was. Silence was power, but only when you decided when to break it. I turned and walked back toward the edge of the property, toward the road. My steps were deliberate, even as wind curled around my legs and the air pressed cold into my lungs. I passed by the old gate, now sensor-controlled and shining too clean, too new, and for a brief moment I looked back. The sun had started to rise. It hit the dirt like gold, like something holy trying to shine through construction dust and betrayal. And I thought, if they think this land is just dirt, they'll never understand what they've truly lost. I slid the notebook back into my coat. The final sentence pressed against my heart like armor. "Losing the house is justice, not tragedy." Let it be so, I thought. Let the justice begin. The letter went out at dawn, not by email, not through a phone call or polite request. It was a certified envelope hand-delivered to both Julian Hart and Hart Living Holdings, LLC. On the front in clean type it read, Notice of intent to initiate legal action. Disputed transfer of property and inheritance clause activation. Inside a statement prepared by Dalton Reeves, signed by me. 17 pages outlining the conditional clause from Richard's handwritten will, a timeline of disputed transactions, and an official declaration that all further development was to cease until the matter could be reviewed in court. At the bottom of the letter, my signature, clean, sharp, final. No more trembling hand. No more wondering if I was doing too much. They'd stolen too much already. It was time to turn the wheel. Hayes had made sure the letter also landed on the desks of every known investor. Private equity resort firms, trust fund babies who wanted a tax break wrapped in heritage. And just to be thorough, he sent it to the planning committee of the county. By 3 p.m., the phones at Hart Living Holdings had gone quiet. By 4:17 p.m., their largest investor sent an official notice of withdrawal pending legal clarity. And by 500, the project was officially listed as paused indefinitely. That's when Julian came knocking. I heard the tires before I saw him gravel crunching in a panic-born rhythm. He didn't knock like a grandson. He knocked like someone who believed ownership gave him the right to enter, to demand, to shout. I opened the door and stood still. He looked disheveled. The jacket-wrinkled hair uncombed, tie loose and half undone. His face was flushed with heat and fury. You sent it, he said. Yes. You didn't even warn me. No, I replied. I didn't. He stepped inside without asking. That told me everything I needed to know. That even now, even after being exposed, he still believed this place was his to walk through. He stood in the center of my living room looking smaller than he did at the engagement party. The bravado was gone. In its place, pure desperation. You're sabotaging everything, he said. You've destroyed months, years of work. No, Julian, I said quietly, you did that yourself. His fists clenched. We had investors. We had permits. We had designs branding a full lifestyle concept. Do you even understand what you've done? I looked at him the way only a mother figure can, like I was seeing through to the boy still hiding behind that angry voice. I understand exactly, I said. You used my name. You used my image. You took what I gave in love and turned it into leverage, and when I wasn't useful anymore, you erased me. His face twisted. That's not true. Isn't it? I cut in, my voice harder now. You built a future on my silence. You paved over your grandfather's resting place. You put my picture on pitch decks and left me off the guest list. And when I sat in the dark and signed those papers for tax purposes, you knew exactly what you were taking. He looked down, just for a second, but it was enough. When he looked up again, his voice cracked not with apology, but fear. We were so close, he said. We were about to break ground on the main lodge. The money was coming in from Arizona. If the Hart name gets dragged into litigation, the Hart name, I said, is already in court. But not because I brought it there, because you sold it without permission. You're ruining my life, he snapped. I stared at him. My life, he said again. You're ruining it. I took a step forward, my feet steady, my spine a rod of something cold and ancient. No, I said. You ruined the name of this family. You made a mockery of your grandfather's memory. You made my love a weapon and my trust your business model. I'm not ruining anything. I'm just knocking on the right doors. He looked at me like he didn't recognize me. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he'd grown so used to the version of me who made excuses, who smiled through insult, who wrote checks in place of boundaries that the woman standing before him now seemed like a stranger. Everything was going to be perfect, he said, his voice smaller now. Celine said it was finally our turn to build something big. I felt a pang then, not sympathy, but sorrow. For the boy I raised, for the boy who used to say, I'm going to build a treehouse that touches the sky, and meant it with wonder, not profit. She built something all right, I said. She built a dream out of your grandfather's grave. She built a future by burying the past, and you handed her the shovel. He sank into the chair across from me, rubbing his hands over his face. They'll pull out, he mumbled. They all will. Good, I said. He looked up, eyes wild, wet at the corners. "You don't mean that." "I do," I said. "Because nothing built on deceit deserves to stand. If it crumbles, let it. Maybe something honest can grow in its place." There was silence between us then, long and wide. "You think this will give you peace?" he asked. "Dragging this out in court, humiliating your own family." I took a breath, deep, centered. "I don't want humiliation," I said. "I want truth. I want protection. I want Richard's name to be spoken with respect, not as a footnote in a luxury resort pitch." He didn't answer. I walked to the mantel and picked up the small framed copy of Richard's last letter. I held it in my hand. "He warned us," I said. "He said if honor leaves the house should leave with it." Julian stood again. He moved toward the door, but slowly. His shoulders sagged, his steps dragged. He turned before opening it. "What are you going to do next?" he asked. I met his eyes. "Finish what I started." And then he left. No hug, no apology, no attempt to salvage what had been shattered. Just the sound of the door clicking shut behind him. I exhaled, not relief, but release. I walked back to the table where Hayes's files still sat. I opened the folder. The timeline, the photos, the forged signatures, the quiet thefts. And I smiled. Not because it was over, but because it had finally begun. The courthouse smelled like polished wood and old decisions. It had been decades since I'd last sat in a room like that. The last time I was signing custody papers, officially becoming Julian's legal guardian. I was wearing my best blazer, my hands trembling with both purpose and fear. That day I felt like I was being handed the future. Today I came to hold it accountable. The courtroom was full, more full than I expected. A few reporters in the back, probably tipped off by someone at City Hall. A couple of investors, arms folded, brows furrowed. Celine wasn't there. She was smart enough to stay away from public proceedings. But Julian, he sat directly across from me, flanked by his lawyer, looking every bit the wounded son. They'd filed their counterclaim within hours of receiving my legal notice. Lucinda Hart is no longer mentally competent to manage matters of property or finance. All previous contracts stand. That was the heart of their defense. Not that I was wrong, that I was confused, that I was old, that I was too late. The judge, a stern man in his 50s with silver hair and eyes like a hawk, looked at me the way men sometimes do when they expect an old woman to speak softly and surrender. I did neither. Dalton stood first. He moved with slow confidence, placing the bound folder of evidence onto the table with a calm thud. "Your Honor, he began this case is not about reclaiming what was lost. It is about halting a misuse of legacy of trust and of the Hart name, one that was built by the woman sitting here and used without her consent for financial gain." He opened the first folder and handed the court clerk the original handwritten clause from Richard's will. Richard's handwriting bold, unmistakable, entirely him. "If my heir fails to maintain the values of the Hart family estate, honor preservation, and remembrance, then all transferred property may be subject to revocation per Olivia Hart's discretion." I watched as the judge read it, his brow furrowed. He didn't look up for several moments. Then came the second folder, Hayes's financial audit, item by item, page by page. Unauthorized use of my accounts, the branding pitch decks, the contracts with Hart Living Holdings signed using documents I never read, the investors' statements extracted carefully. We were told this was a fully family-backed project led by Ms. Hart. I wasn't the founder, I was the mascot, until I wasn't even that. Julian's attorney stood next. "You Honor," she began with a kind voice, too sweet, too rehearsed. "Mrs. Hart is a deeply respected woman. We do not dispute her love for this family, nor her generous history. But this claim is not a matter of fraud. It is a matter of perception. Our client, Julian Hart, was under the impression that Mrs. Hart was fully informed of the financial direction of the estate, and due to her advancing age entrusted him with those decisions." She turned to me, smiled. "We believe she did so willingly, if not formally." And yet Dalton countered, stepping forward. "There is no evidence of informed consent. No documented delegation of authority, no video, no witness beyond a notary arranged by the opposing party. We do, however, have proof that Julian and Celine stood to make millions on land that includes the burial site of Richard E. Hart. There was a rustle through the room, a shift in weight. People sat up straighter. Julian shifted too, uneasy. The judge turned to me then. "Mrs. Hart, he said you are at the center of this matter. Do you wish to speak?" I stood slowly. My knees protested, but my spine didn't. I stepped forward and placed my hands on the wooden rail in front of me. I didn't read from notes. I didn't bring a statement. I brought the truth. "I'm not here to get my house back," I said. The room stilled. "I am not here to punish my grandson, even if he deserves it. I am here because what was once sacred in this family has been paved over literally, and I won't watch my husband's name, my name, become just another line in someone's financial portfolio." I looked straight at Julian. "You want to build a resort. Build one, but not on the ashes of the man who raised you, not on a lie, not using the last good thing this family had left." I turned to the judge again. "I do not want the property returned to me. I want it given permanently to the people of this community, to Hartville, as a memorial garden, a protected public space. Let it belong to those who still understand what heritage means." Gasps. Even Dalton blinked. Julian's mouth fell open. I continued. "I want the land placed under the stewardship of the local conservation board. I will sign whatever is needed. I want every document Julian and Celine filed to be reviewed, and anything bearing my name to be publicly retracted. I want the record to show that I did not approve of this, that I did not forget who we were." The judge watched me in silence. Then he nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Hart." I returned to my seat. The silence was thick. The judge called a recess. The gavel sounded once sharp, sudden. Julian followed me out into the hall. "Why?" he asked, his voice half shattered, half bitter. "Why not just take it back? If you were going to do all this, why give it away?" I turned to face him. "Because it's not yours," I said, "and it's not mine anymore either." I stepped closer, lowered my voice. "It belongs to the memory of the man who built it, to the people who need green space more than they need spas, to the history you tried to sell." He said nothing. "You broke the family, Julian, but I won't rebuild it in your name. I'll plant something else in its place." He looked at me like a man watching his world collapse and not knowing how to save even a piece. "I didn't think you'd fight back," he whispered. "No," I said. "You thought I'd stay quiet, but you forgot I was the first to sign, and now I'm the last." It unraveled faster than I thought. 3 days after the court ruling, the headlines spread like brushfire through every local and regional news outlet. "The last signer speaks Lucinda Hart ends legacy to save its name. From inheritance to infamy, Hart family dispute ends in public donation. Silenced no more widow blocks 38 Milellas. Development donates land to Hartville." But the one that struck me deepest came from the Ledger, a quiet column tucked between politics and the weather report. "When legacy becomes currency, what we owe the women who remember." I didn't read the full piece. I didn't need to. The headline said it all. The court had sided with me. Not because I was loud, not because I begged, but because the truth stood tall beside me, paper-clipped and notarized, covered in my husband's handwriting and the ink of my resolve. Julian lost, officially. The development permits were rescinded. The land was designated for transfer to the Hartville Conservancy Board, pending final paperwork. The investors who hadn't already fled gone within a week. Celine. She vanished first. The morning the ruling was finalized, she released a statement to a lifestyle blog known more for wedding exposés than ethics. "While I remain proud of the vision Julian and I created, I cannot remain engaged in a project surrounded by family conflict and legal controversy. I wish Julian peace and clarity as he moves forward without me. No name, no ring, just space." He moved out of the house a few days later. Some said he checked into a hotel. Others claimed he flew to Miami. I didn't care. What followed wasn't silence, it was reckoning. A second investigation opened this time by the state auditor's office. A whistleblower from one of the investor firms submitted a report suggesting Julian had presented falsified letters of endorsement bearing my forged initials. Then came the real blow, a subpoena. One of the early-stage venture contracts drawn up months before he'd even spoken to me about the project clearly outlined a brand architecture plan using the Hart Legacy name. The attached footnotes referenced elderly trust as a marketing angle. It was buried in marketing strategy. Buried in arrogance, I wasn't angry anymore. I was something colder, something Julian wouldn't recognize, accountable. The last message I received from him came in the form of a letter. It arrived folded in a creased envelope, no return address. The handwriting was his slanted, rushed. You could have just told me you hated me. You didn't have to take everything. There's nothing left now. I folded it once, twice, then lit a match and let it burn. Because that's what you do with rot. You don't save it. You start over. The house. Still standing for now. The town council would vote in the coming weeks to rename the land Hart Memorial Grove, a green space open to children, veterans, and the elderly. They asked if I wanted a statue. I said no. I didn't want to be cast in stone. I wanted air, earth, growth, something Richard would have approved of. Something built from integrity, not blueprints. As for me, I didn't return to the old house. I left the keys with the court. I let it be emptied and prepped for public transition. Instead, I rented a small flat above a bookstore in the south end of Hartville. The walls smelled like paper and cinnamon. I liked that. Every morning I'd walk to the edge of the town square and sit beneath the same elm tree Richard once carved our initials into L+R Hart around it, faded with time but never erased. I watched mothers push strollers, kids toss backpacks, retired men sip coffee in ceramic mugs. None of them knew what the land had cost me, but they didn't need to. That was the point. One afternoon, a little girl walked by with her grandmother. She saw me reading and smiled. I nodded. She turned to her grandma and asked, "Is that the lady from the news?" The old woman paused, looked at me, then said, "No, that's the woman who gave us the garden." That was enough. The house wasn't much. Just a one-bedroom cottage at the edge of the Hartville Grove, with ivy growing up the back and shutters painted a soft chipped blue. The deed didn't bear my name. It belonged to the town. A gift, they'd said. A thank you. A shelter for the woman who gave them back the ground under their feet. The mayor had offered to read a speech when I moved in. I told him to save his breath. I wasn't interested in applause. I was interested in quiet, in peace, in doing small things that mattered again. They let me choose the garden. I picked saplings instead of flowers, because I didn't want beauty that bloomed for a moment. I wanted something that stayed. The children started showing up on their own. It began with a boy named Malik, who found a stray kitten behind the park benches and came to my door asking if I had a box. Then it was twins Anna and Eli who wandered into the garden during cleanup week and never stopped coming. Soon they brought friends. I started keeping a basket of seed packets on the porch. By summer, we had tomatoes, sunflowers, and a lemon tree with 2 hopeful fruits clinging to life. They called me Park Grandma, sometimes Miss Lucy, but mostly Balushi Convien. I taught them how to dig, how to water without drowning the roots, how to watch, not rush. And every Friday afternoon I told stories, old ones, real ones. Some I lived, some I heard whispered in my grandmother's kitchen. They sat cross-legged in the grass dirt on their knees, eyes wide, as if my voice carried some kind of spell. One day I told them the story of a woman who loved too silently for too long, and how she found her voice not in shouting, but in stopping someone else's lie. I didn't say it was me, they knew anyway. Imani came one morning with fresh-baked cornbread wrapped in cloth. She wore her old librarian glasses, even though she hadn't worked a desk in 10 years. "Your tomatoes are taking over the fence," she said as she walked into the kitchen. "At this rate, they'll vote you off the property." We laughed. She poured 2 mugs of lemon tea. We sat on the back steps in the light. "You really don't miss it?" she asked finally, her voice low. "The old house, the walls, the view." I let the breeze answer first. Then I said, "I don't miss space that never held me. That house stopped being mine the moment my name disappeared from its heartbeat." She looked at me sideways. "You gave up a lot." I nodded. "I gave up a roof, not my roots." There was silence for a moment. Then I added, "I don't need a big house. I need shade I can sit under without asking permission." She reached over, took my hand. That she said sounds like something only a woman who's lost everything can say, and still sound full. "I'm not full," I said softly, "but I'm no longer hollow." She smiled, and we watched the kids from the window chasing dandelion fluff like it held secrets. That night I lit a single candle in the corner of the room, not for ritual, just for remembering. I opened Richard's old notebook, the one I hadn't touched in weeks. The spine was worn, the corners frayed. On the inside cover, in that familiar print, he had written, "Build things that outlive you, or you'll die more than once." I read it twice. Then I closed the book, looked around. This house had no marble, no inheritance. But it had laughter. It had soil. And it had me, finally, fully still here, still standing, and never again signed away. The letter arrived folded 3 times, sealed with nothing but a smudge of sweat and haste. No envelope, no postmark, just tucked under the garden gate by someone who didn't want to be seen. I knew it was from Julian before I even touched it. There's a way regret lingers on paper creases, too sharp handwriting that stops and stutters like someone unsure whether to confess or accuse. I didn't open it at first, just looked at it. Then I made tea, swept the porch, watched the sky burn into its usual apricot dusk. When I finally sat down and unfolded it, it said only this: "I was wrong. But you didn't have to be cruel, Grandma. You didn't have to ruin me." That was it. No apology. No ownership. Just the same half-formed guilt he'd learned from a world that taught men to grieve their losses louder than their betrayals. I held the letter between my fingers like it was something poisonous but delicate. Then I placed it gently on the windowsill beside the blooming orchid. A soft white one, the kind Richard used to buy me from roadside flower stalls back when we had nothing but chalk dust in our pockets. Its petals curled around the paper as if shielding it from the sun or judging it. I wasn't sure which. I didn't reply, because sometimes silence isn't surrender, it's punctuation. That night I sat by the old pine rocking chair I'd found at the town flea market. It creaked like bones remembering weather. I liked that about it. Things that creak don't lie, they only speak slowly. I thought of all the chairs that had been pulled out from under me in life. My mother's kitchen chair empty after her stroke. The chair across the courtroom when Julian wouldn't meet my eyes. The chair at the head of my own dining table left bare while strangers toasted on carpet I once paid to lay. And now I had this chair. It didn't have my name carved into it. Didn't need to. Because it held me. Because I chose it, because it didn't belong to a memory, it belonged to this breath, this day. A soft knock broke the stillness around midnight. I opened the door to find Anna, the little one with the missing front tooth, and the world's most persistent sunflower obsession. She held a small paper plate covered in aluminum foil. "Mom made brownies. She said bring you 2. "Just 2, I teased. She grinned. 1.5, I ate half. I laughed, took the plate, kissed the top of her tangled head. "You're forgiven." She turned to leave, then paused. "Miss Lucy." "Yes, you know the man who used to live in the big house?" My body paused just slightly. "Julian." She nodded. "My mom said he doesn't come here anymore?" "No," I said. "He doesn't." She thought a moment, then whispered, "Did he take your house?" I knelt beside her, looked her straight in the eyes. "No, baby, he tried, but I gave it away before he could steal it." She blinked. "Why?" I smiled. "Because giving something away out of love is different than having it taken out of greed." She nodded like she understood more than she should, then ran down the path, bare feet slapping the dirt. The next morning the wind carried the smell of something blooming. I stepped out, tea in hand, wrapped in the old cardigan Richard gave me our last Christmas together. The orchid leaned toward the morning light, delicate and defiant. The letter still sat beside it, faded, sagging slightly from the night air. A small spider had made a home beneath the fold. It felt correct. Some things don't need to be burned. They just need to rot on their own and be left alone. I breathed in, held it, and then the voice came. Not out loud, not from the trees or from memory, but from that small, final place inside me that once whispered doubt and now hummed peace. They thought the final signature was to take it back. But it was never about reclaiming. It was about ending. Ending the theft of silence, ending the idea that kindness must always come without claws, ending the version of Lucinda Hart, who believed that family meant loyalty, even when loyalty meant swallowing your own name. I didn't want the house. I didn't want revenge. I wanted the truth to outlive the lie. And now it would. Forever on green grass where children chase wind. On benches where old men tell jokes with cracked teeth. Under trees that shade grief and laughter alike. That's what my signature built. Not a fortune, but a legacy no one can trademark. And this was the final silence. Not defeat, not surrender, just peace.